Well, here we are. My first review of Doctor Who Series 14, or Season 1, whatever you want to call it. I really didn't think the first full series written by RTD I'd review would be this one, but hey, here we are. And despite my aspirations to actually review RTD's real Series 1, it seems like it's gonna have to wait, because I think I can add a lot more to the discussion on this new era of the show as opposed to the old one. And honestly, I have to use the first era as good examples of writing so often that I might as well have already reviewed it. But alas, its time will come eventually, but today we'll be going through the Church on Ruby Road and discussing why, honestly, it's just not that good. I've sat on this episode for over 6 months now at the time of this being written, and truth be told, I've never really been a fan of it. Not to say it's devoid of quality or anything, but I just remember the episode itself didn't really leave much of an impact on me, despite probably being a fair warning that this new series of Doctor Who isn't going to be that good. And was it? Well, let's find out at the beginning of the newest era of Doctor Who, and let's review The Church on Mid-Space Baba. So this episode starts with this cringe voiceover from the Doctor explaining that Ruby was left on the church door by her mother, and for me, this immediately fails at introducing supposed new viewers to Doctor Who. I'd sort of touched on in my Giggle review that I think the idea of this fresh reboot was kind of stupid in and of itself, but I think if they really wanted to do it this way, they shouldn't have the Doctor be the one giving this monologue, and this should have all been from Ruby's perspective. I think this would have been way more effective had the monologue just not been included and we simply heard the TARDIS start to land and then the title sequence hits. I mean, obviously this scene is recontextualized later and sets up one of the many series arcs that completely suck, but if this series was really trying to be a fresh start to a new era of Doctor Who, then you need the Doctor to be a mystery and not outright have him say his own name in a voiceover. The reason the other Doctor's first stories besides this one work at keeping the audience engaged and introducing us to the show is because we see the Doctor through the eyes of the companion, which makes sense because they're the audience surrogate. A role which the companion is tailor-made for, not the Doctor, especially not the Doctor straight away. Because the Doctor is practically the immortal genius who explains all of the interesting stuff to us, and if you just start the new era like that right off the bat, it immediately makes you feel disengaged. And if you really wanted to include this stupid voiceover, then you should have just cut out the part where the Doctor is mentioned and have Ruby be the one to deliver it. Rewrite it in a way to sound more like her and have it recontextualized after the title sequence to her explaining this to Davina McCall. We're off to a great start. Speaking of great starts, they somehow managed to mess up the title sequence for this series immediately. Despite adding this shot which looks gorgeous and fixing the cheap looking spinning logo, somehow when changing the names from David Tennant and Catherine Tate to Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson, they managed to mess up the tracking on the TARDIS when it reveals their names. It's hard to notice at first, but once you see it, it's impossible to unsee. How, in the name of all that's holy and sane, has Doctor Who been back on the air for nearly 20 years, yet they still managed to make such glaring mistakes in the opening sequence is a mystery to me. At this point, we haven't had a perfect title sequence since the 11th Doctor, and even his got ruined in Series 7. I know that not many of you, besides this fun man, watching this are editors as well, but this seriously is such an easy thing to fix. It's absolutely insane that no one noticed this during production. All you'd have to do to fix this is move the tracking on the TARDIS over by a couple frames. I could do that! Have you seen me? I'm stupid! And I've been editing on this crappy little laptop for over 4 years now. The thing's basically kaput, and yet I don't have millions of dollars and the BBC and Disney behind us. In fact, the BBC seem to actively hate me, but still. So we cut to our new companion, Ruby Sunday, who I definitely don't find outrageously attractive on this show with Davina McCall, who I definitely knew existed before I had to ask my mum who she was. If I, a proud Brit, doesn't even know who she is, I'm sure the international viewers the show is apparently trying to appeal to now felt very outcasted by this scene. But apparently she does this show where orphans find their biological parents, and this can lead to some natural exposition to explore some of Ruby's character traits. A blonde 19-year-old just sort of going through the motions and waiting for her life to properly start?
I am. I was found old.
I wouldn't say that if I were you. So we see a bunch of what later turns out to be goblins messing with Ruby repeatedly, while also showing the Doctor stalking her. Glad that this story establishes that Ruby has friends and is musically talented, and this is only relevant once in episode 2, then never again. But then, yet again, we get more complete disconnect for the audience here, because it really just makes us wonder why he's doing this. The Doctor's first scene really should have been him catching the glass, because not only does it introduce the audience to him naturally with mystery, but it's also better because we see him through Ruby's perspective, instead of already knowing who he is and eventually what he'll do. I must say though, the Doctor dancing in a kilt at the function, yeah, this is my Doctor Who. Also, I don't know what it's like down south, but up here in the north, this is the exact reason that nightclubs give you plastic cups. So we see the goblins try to kill Ruby outside this very familiar looking building. And the Doctor saves her before we get some absolutely brilliant lines from the Doctor. Ncuti delivers all these lines with such amazing charisma and timing, you'd be convinced he'd been playing the Doctor for 3 series at this point.
Okay. Name, the Doctor. Occupation, not a doctor. Current status, just passing by. Employer, myself. Address, that blue box over there. Now, if you don't mind, I just got snowman, and I would like to go home.
Seriously, the absolute insane jump in delivery from 13 to 15 is astounding. Ncuti just feels so much like the Doctor already. He does a fantastic job throughout this story. He's great.
But how do you know she'll say yes?
Because the sales start on Tuesday, and you just couldn't wait. And that's why she loves you. Merry Christmas.
How is he just so good already, man? Unfortunately, one thing that's not good about this Doctor is his sonic screwdriver. This thing absolutely fucking sucks, and there's no denying it. Especially after the 14th Doctor's one, which admittedly I wasn't a fan of at first, but it did really grow on me, despite how disgustingly OP it was. But this thing just looks daft. Sky remote, Homo sapien remote looking at trash. Why did Russell change the iconic shape of the sonic screwdriver after 50 years? Well, unfortunately, a very similar reason as to why he retconned Davros' origin in that stupid kids special. Essentially, damage control for issues that no one with a brain is really complaining about. I mean, more so this than Davros, because Moffat did really make Davros look worse by having the Doctor do something so insanely out of character like this in his last appearance. But whoever in the history of forever who isn't an absolute fish has complained that the sonic screwdriver looked like a gun? In what reality does this and this look remotely similar? And considering besides a few stupid scenes dotted through New Who, the Sonic never shoots anything out of it besides a light, I have no idea where he's got this alleged complaint from and why he decided to make this change. And it really doesn't help how ugly the new Sonic is. And funnily enough, because of its extended width, it actually looks more like a gun than it ever has before in this series. Absolutely senseless schlock. So we get our first scene with Mrs. Flood, which immediately sets up the tone of this strange character, who we still don't actually have an answer for who she is. Hopefully series 15, but honestly given how Russell resolved some of the story arcs in this series, I really can't get my hopes up for anything too interesting anymore. Which is a shame, because all of her scenes this series are very intriguing, and Anita Dobson plays this mysterious character very well, and extremely effectively in some stories. So while I will still compliment the scene she's in, don't be surprised if by the time I review the series where the reveal is, that I'll end up saying they're all a bit retroactively shit. Which is why I'm very glad I waited until this series was over before I started reviewing it. Because if I'd spent 8 videos saying how much the snow interested me, only to end up with that being the payoff in the finale, I'd be 10 times more pissed off than I am right now. And it's at this point in the story where I have to point out how naff the directing in this story is. And it's really noticeable how poor it is after all of the specials were beautifully done through and through. This episode is riddled with those awful uncomfortable close-ups and the inability to keep the camera still that plagued the Chibnall era for years and was part of the reason it was so unwatchable. And to the surprise of absolutely no one, this episode was directed by a director from the Chibnall era. Explains a lot, really. And I'm just saying, all the directors from the 60th were right there. None of them have even had any work since they did those episodes, so would bringing them back for one more story really have been too much to ask for? So we meet Ruby's mum, Carla, and this scene introduces her quite well and makes her a believable and likeable character, showing off her loving and caring nature, especially at the excitement of getting to foster another child. Immediately setting up the feeling of family and home that this series should hopefully explore really well. And we even get something the last era was lacking so much of. Good jokes!
She's called Lulu Bell.
What a terrible name.
Oh, an absolutely terrible name.
Isn't it awful?
I am not going anywhere. Shackle me to this bed. And where is my cup of tea?
I can't say we're so incredibly back anymore because I know as a fact that that's not true, but at least we're still leagues above the previous era, so I'll take the few small victories I can get. So Davina calls Ruby to tell her there's no trace of her parents, and retroactively, this is something that doesn't really make a lick of sense. So there's no trace of either of Ruby's parents on any database in the world, despite the fact they're two just normal people. Yeah, I'm not buying that. There's no way that two normal-ass people haven't at least been to the doctors or the dentist at any point in their lives. Surely they must have jobs, properties under their name, credit or debit cards, fucking anything! It's very clear looking back that Russell just put these lines in to keep the audience invested in the mystery of the series, but this just fails once you know the answer, and the answer is just a load of bollocks anyway. But we'll get to that when I review Empire of Death. You ever wondered why Series 6 is such a slog to rewatch once you know all the answers? Same reason as this. Millie Gibson's performance is at least very standout in this scene, but that's then undermined when Davina McCall, while trying to remind the audience this episode is meant to have a plot, is killed by a Christmas tree. Excuse me, but what the fuck? How on fucking earth is that a scene I just witnessed and experienced in the year of our Lord 2023? Are you fucking kidding me? Ignoring the fact that this is played off as serious despite how inherently funny this is, how on earth is anyone on the planet going to die from a cheap plastic Christmas tree decoration? You know these things are usually just a piece of plastic or foam crap, which later with that much glitter you'll look like a tree just after holding one? It would have to be going so much faster than falling velocity speed to even properly hurt someone, let alone kill them! Why did Russell have so much more self-awareness writing goofy shit in the 2000s compared to now? Don't get me wrong, Doctor Who has always been filled with goofy shit. It's just as much a part of the show's character as bad effects and the TARDIS. But when it reaches the point of unrealism to the point where characters can see something hurtling towards their face and don't even attempt to shield their eyes, that's when my immersion shattered. And trust me, as an avid classic Who hater, who gave it as many chances as humanly possible, it takes a lot to break my immersion. But nonsense like this, especially in the new show, takes me out of it immediately. So Ruby hears the baby with the terrible name get kidnapped by goblins in this terribly edited sequence before she climbs on the roof and eventually gets on the ladder. And then we get another scene which could have been the Doctor's first and would be so much more effective had we not already seen him multiple times in the story. Seriously, imagine how much more impactful it would have been, and honestly just funny, if we hadn't directly seen the Doctor in the story properly until right now. Ruby does the voiceover at the beginning, but we still hear the TARDIS land. The Doctor still catches her drink, but after that he just walks away. And instead of showing the Doctor save Ruby from the snowman, we see the devastation about to be caused, and we just get a low angle shot of the Sonic fixing the lights before walking off. And then after a few subtle hints and moments such as those, nodding to us who already know the show that the Doctor's the one doing this, but then for new viewers, this is the first thing they see the Doctor say or even really properly do.
What the hell are you doing?
I'm just
Well, what did you do that for? Who sees a ladder and just pops on?
How much more impactful would that have been over awkwardly edited shots of the Doctor in the same room, but because of the lack of establishing this location, we have no clue where he is compared to her, and him saving her because he's just watching her for seemingly no reason at this point. As good as the scene with the policeman is, I'd be perfectly willing to sacrifice it if it means we get a better introduction to the Doctor as a character for new and old audiences. Since, lest we forget, this episode is meant to be the 2023 equivalent of Rose, which it's already majorly failing at. And since the Doctor is technically pre-established, we could have got a scene more like this one, with an actual conflict after.
Because I was just travelling past, I swear. I was just wandering. I wasn't looking for trouble. Honestly, I wasn't, but I noticed these plasma cores around the hospital. Like that lightning, that's a plasma core. It's been building up for 2 days now. So I checked in. I thought something was going on inside. Turns out the plasma coils with the Jadoon up above.
Like, yeah, we get a teeny tiny scene of the two conflicting after this, but it just wasn't enough. So the goat jumps on the ladder and shoves on these intelligent gloves that take all your weight, and I'm glad they at least introduced these here. Not only because they play a key part in the finale, but also in this story. Even if the finale is absolutely fucking goddamn awful, but don't worry, we'll get there eventually.
Do you know why they call them goblins? Because they like to gobble you up.
And what would they do to us?
Oh, they'll eat us too.
He's already got the mannerisms of the Doctor down to a key, man. I really hope Russell gives him some great character work to go with as well. I'm not gonna scream this time. So they don't eat them for some reason and tie them up for some reason, and the Doctor explains how the goblins feed off coincidence and chance. This is actually a fairly interesting and creative concept for a villain, which I do actually quite like, but unfortunately because the goblins are, well, just goblins, I feel like this creative idea was kind of wasted in this story. As despite being the crux for the plot, the goblins feel very useless and underwhelming in this story. Like, they have such a non-threatened presence that honestly, until I started writing this review 6 months after the episode came out, I completely forgot that they were in this story.
expert in time traveling goblins and
They are not time travelers. Excuse me. Time travelers are great. Like the best. Like, wow.
Guys, like, you don't understand how good he is. Like, wow, this is refreshing after the last 6 years. So the Doctor frees them and we get a brilliant scene of him deducting the language of rope so that he can escape. Great way of establishing the Doctor's intelligence to new audience, and just a great scene on its own as well. So they find the goblins again and we get the most unserious, goofy, unexpected thing imaginable. The goblins start singing the creatively titled Goblin Song, and I'm not gonna lie, I fucking love this scene. Not only is it made 10 times funnier by the reactions of the Doctor and Ruby, but I can't lie, I do quite like this song. Like, it is very obvious that it's ADR, which does break the immersion slightly, but also it cannot be understated how well this builds to the reveal of the absolute munter Goblin King. Like, the song builds up so well to the reveal of this brilliantly realized villain, but it's weird how the first villain of 15's tenure is a big, ugly blob that doesn't speak. I know this might appear contradictory since a lot of this review I've been criticizing this episode for not being like Rose, but it's at this point that the parallels and lazy copying are hard to go unnoticed. A 19-year-old wanderer who just so happens to be bad as fuck, looking for something to do in life. The Doctor saves their life. They then meet with the Doctor properly because the aliens are fucking with them. They have to save someone they care about with the Doctor. And now, the villain is just a big, voiceless blob of a threat. And you might be wondering, if Rose is being used as a positive example all of this time, then what makes the church on Ruby Road so mid? Well, it's because this is Russell lazily rehashing his old work with a new coat of paint, but missing out key parts that made Rose such an effective reopening to the show. And also, truth be told, as much as I am using Rose as a positive example, the episode really isn't that good. But it was good for what it had to do at the time. It was the perfect sort of episode to bring Doctor Who back from the dead and re-establish it to old viewers. This isn't going to be that cheesy pantomime dog shit from the 80s, and it's going to be some new, real grap sauce. However, despite this era supposedly being a soft reboot, and even rebranding to renumber the series, it really isn't. So this story doesn't work at reintroducing the show to old viewers, or introducing it to new viewers, because this type of structured story isn't really anything new at this point. Rose came out in 2005, and even then, the story it was telling wasn't amazing, but it worked well enough to establish the characters and bring the show back. This episode came out in 2023, so this type of story is 1,000 times less compelling on its own, and is nowhere near as interesting because it doesn't make use of the advantages it has, and seems more focused on shit that ultimately doesn't matter. And I think this song is a perfect example of that. The Goblin song was all over the marketing for this story, instead of, oh, you know, the Doctor or Ruby, the characters we're meant to be interested in and following for 8 weeks. But nah, let's just focus on the ultimately pointless and nonsensical spectacle instead of focusing on the characters we're meant to care about and watch through the series, because that's such a better use of everyone's time, you absolutely obtuse ham! And as if this wasn't in and of itself emblematic of how dull the Doctor and Ruby go on to be. So the Doctor cleverly ensures their safety and they put the baby back. God only knows why the goblins didn't just cut the rope and kill them both, but logical consistency clearly wasn't the goal with this story. Or this series, for a matter of fact. So fuck knows why I even care. So 15 shows that he's a god of Riz, more on that much later, and we get a scene of the Doctor and Ruby trying to make the house safe. We then see how many children Carla has fostered, which is quite nice, and we see the first of how the Doctor's rest has affected 15, with him not seeming upset or down about the Time Lords being dead, but he's still suitably melancholic when discussing it. And I'm glad here that Russell didn't make a big fuss about it, because the whole point of the 60th was to remove this burden from the Doctor, and a lot of inconsistent character beats are written in because he seems to forget about it in a lot of this series. But I'm glad it was at least acknowledged here in a natural way.
Shame it happens 3 episodes in a row.
So Carla comes back and Ruby tells her about the call, and I do like how this scene establishes the themes of family and love for the series, which they hopefully reinforce a lot through the series, as Ruby and Carla's relationship is set up to be really strong and wholesome, and Carla should be an important recurring character in the series, and her dynamic with Ruby is just so enjoyable to watch, and ties her back down to earth,
naturally and effectively.
So glad to finally be having a family dynamic that feels important again, for the first time since Donna fucking Noble in 2008. Now, if only I didn't say all of that full well knowing that this series completely underutilizes her and her character has a little to no bearing or presence in any future story in this season so far. Which unfortunately, unless Series 15 fixes, which at this very moment I doubt it will, makes a lot of scenes like this feel very pointless overall. Which then brings up my next complaint with this episode, which I'm sure you might have picked up on by now given how much I've had to say about the last 5 minutes of the story. And that's that the pacing in this story is absolutely fucking awful. Seriously, we are now more than halfway through this episode and practically nothing has happened. Why the fuck did you write it this way? The plot is so extremely paper thin that we've only really just had one chunk of the story focus on it so far, and not even for very long. Just over 10 minutes of this story so far has focused on the goblins, and they're so paper thin and dull that the only thing memorable about them is that stupid corny song. The rest of the episode has been spent establishing character beats and narratives to explore through the series. But having seen the full series, I know a lot of this shit doesn't really go anywhere, making this episode incredibly boring to rewatch.
15 and Ruby.
Alright, yeah!
So Carla points out a bunch of coincidences which give the goblins more power before the Doctor tells her to stop, before stupidly pointing out a coincidence himself, leading to a shockwave sent through the flat, and Ruby disappears. Damn, if only that could have been easily prevented, you sexy idiot. We then get this really long, drawn out scene, establishing that Ruby disappeared and how much her being gone has affected Carla's life. While it is a nice sentiment showing how much Ruby has changed her life and her as a person for the better, this scene just goes on and 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 on, and it never fucking ends! Oh my god, we get it! At this point, the plot has already taken a seat further back than Danny DeVito's hairline, so at this point, I don't see how or why the episode didn't spend more time on the Doctor and Ruby's relationship to make this moment more impactful instead of just cutting out some of the time-wasting scenes this story has. Because while this scene is good on first-time viewings, on rewatches, it's so dull, and it then begs the question as to why this makes the Doctor cry. As someone who sounds like me but isn't me said in this video, I don't have an issue with the Doctor crying. Of course I don't. That would be a fucking ridiculous thing to say. But one part of 15 that makes a lot of his heavier scenes way less impactful is that he cries in almost every episode he's in. And for a lot of the reasons that wouldn't make the Doctor cry. Like, yes, here, he is losing someone that he cares about and knows a lot of foster children likely have lived without a home, but when you really deep it, he doesn't know who Ruby is, at least that well. He has no reason to be this upset that it would make him cry. The Doctor crying is something that should be saved for huge moments of loss or grief or anger in the show, because watching the Doctor holding back his emotions can be way more impactful a lot of the time. And then when he eventually does cry, it has a billion times the impact, because we so rarely see him do it. But here, this almost feels out of character because of how sudden it is. This scene would have been way more effective had we seen Carla crying without knowing why, as opposed to seeing her and the Doctor crying. Not only would this be a nice subtle callback to Series 5 in the best episode of Series 5, by the way, but it would also further strengthen the Doctor's character. Like, imagine how much less impactful Rory's death in Series 5 would be if 11 was crying about it. It's way more compelling seeing how upset he is, but knowing that he isn't gonna cry about it. It's way more impactful just seeing how much it upsets him without him crying. I have no problems with the Doctor being more vulnerable and emotional. My favourite Doctor, and coincidentally the best written Doctor, is the first one to cry at a companion departure because he was so emotionally attached to her. But arguably sometimes seeing him holding back the sadness would hit a lot harder than the times he did cry. Not always though, like sometimes seeing him cry could just straight up destroy your soul.
I could do so much more! So much more!
The culmination of events built up through 4 series leading to the Doctor's biggest mental breakdown ever is how you effectively write something like this. If the 15th Doctor ever has a scene like this, it'll never be as impactful, since we've known since day 2 that he's prone to crying over things that wouldn't upset the Doctor that much, and the rest of the series really doesn't help that either. So the Doctor goes to Ruby Road 2004. No idea how he knows when Ruby was born, or when for that fact, since no mention of Ruby's age or that she was left at a church was made to him, but hey, accept it, don't question it, don't think about it. As if it doesn't make the already poor opening of this episode 100 times less impactful as well. You stupid, hefty plastic licking scrub! So the goblins take baby Ruby and the Doctor does something which I find insanely out of character and stupid, no matter which way you look at it. So he uses the Super Mario gloves to pull the ship down so he can rescue baby Ruby. While I like that there's a nice setup and payoff for the gloves in this episode alone, the way he does this really makes no sense when you think about it properly. Okay, so first of all, how does the Doctor know exactly where to pull down to kill the Goblin King, and not just impale baby Ruby? Bear in mind, he has no idea where she is, and she's actually extremely close to the Goblin King, and if this was literally just a couple of feet off, he would have killed her. 2. Why does the Doctor go straight to killing the Goblin King instead of at least trying to reason with him? I get that he's on a time crunch, but considering he has the super gloves, he can climb really quickly, and it just seems a bit out of character for the Doctor's first resort to be murder, and murder in such a violent way. I'm not opposed to the Doctor killing people because it usually gives us some of the most interesting dilemmas and scenes that the show and the character has to offer, but as a first resort? Yeah, that's kind of fucked. And funnily enough, despite this episode blatantly ripping off Rosa points, that episode managed to kill the alien threat in a much more natural and character-fitting way.
That was just insurance, I wasn't going to use it.
And in this episode, despite seemingly doing this on purpose, the Doctor doesn't show any remorse or regret for what he did, and just happily moves on afterwards. 3rd, how the fuck did the Doctor perfectly catch Ruby? He had no way of knowing exactly where she was, but she just so happens to coincidentally land exactly where he was. Coincidence? I like to call it contrivance. And remember how I said this ruins the already shit opening before? Well, here's 4th. Another way this episode could have opened more effectively. Maybe instead of hearing or seeing the TARDIS land, we have an establishing shot of the church, with the Doctor waiting nearby, obscured in the frame, waiting for the goblins to arrive. This not only keeps up the mystery of the story and why he's here for the old viewers, but new viewers would immediately find him mysterious and interesting. And if he's just fiddling around with some gloves with no explanation until now, what a way to hook people in! And it would also naturally lead the Doctor to find the church better instead of him just knowing where it is and exactly when to be somehow. 5th, why did the Doctor put all of his faith and hope that 3% of battery power would be enough to pull this entire ship down?
You know why? Because they have faith.
Shut up!
Faith! The magic word that keeps you never having to think for yourself.
Insane bit of wishful thinking from the Doctor. He's just very lucky that this stupid story was bad enough to have him luckily succeed with this. Also, the goblins just conveniently disappear and all is resolved after that. Wow, that was definitely a satisfying ending and didn't feel rushed and contrived at all. What an absolute schlocky pile of contrived, half-baked, undercooked, raw, gormless shite. That was... wow. Colour me considerably unimpressed, to say the least. Colour this episode ruined, to say the most. So the Doctor sees Ruby's mum and doesn't say or do anything to her because he's a twat. Fully missed opportunity to show the Doctor is a flawed person by confronting her here, but no. We need stakes and interest for the finale, when we inevitably find out who Ruby is because plot. Don't worry, we'll get to that fucking garbage eventually, just give it time. So this overly happy, annoying Christmas music plays and Ruby is back. The Doctor then saves Davina McCall from being attacked by a Christmas tree, then returns only to not question Mrs. Flood obviously having seen the TARDIS disappear and reappear, because of course he wouldn't do that. Before we properly cut back to Ruby and her family, and I do like that Ruby on her own figures out that the Doctor is a time traveller, as it sets up her character as very proactive and can actually think for herself, and actually has her own opinion and thoughts. I know that sounds like a very low bar praise, but don't forget that despite having 4 companions over the last 5 years, they were all boiled down just one entity that only exists to ask questions and not really do anything else of note, ever. It is nice to have a believable person as the companion again, and this naturally sets up how Ruby is smart and capable, despite having a sad backstory. A rare character beat for the Doctor and or Ruby that is consistent through the series. Holy shit, it's almost as if Russell T Davies wrote this. Well, he did, but I mean like the goat, not the washed. However, the scene of her seeing the TARDIS is unfortunately another one that feels very dragged out just for the sake of it. Like, wouldn't it have been better had we only got the Mrs. Flood scene of her breaking the fourth wall, instead of having Ruby relying on her to find the TARDIS, then her going in and doing the basic 360 of the TARDIS? Wow. 2 scenes in this story that feel extremely dragged out and poorly paced. If only there were other things in this story that time could have been spent on, instead of this shite.
Who are you?
I'm the Doctor.
Shooty, I love you with all of my cold, dead black heart for your portrayal of the Doctor, but even you couldn't save this shit. So, that was the church on Ruby Road. And unfortunately, this episode doesn't hold up very well on rewatch, and with further context for the rest of the series, it makes it even worse. While I never really was a big fan of this episode, I did watch it blasted mortal on Christmas Day, so I did get quite a bit of enjoyment out of it. But unfortunately, it really isn't that good. In fact, it's quite mid. While the Doctor and Ruby are both introduced quite well, it could have been done so much better in so much more effective and impactful ways than it was. And I think the lack of the two having any real conflict with each other in this story is emblematic of a bigger issue that plagues this series as a whole. That being that the Doctor and Ruby just immediately get along and don't really conflict, leaving them both being nowhere near as interesting as they should be, despite the amazing potential they both obviously have. But with this being their first appearance together, they're fine in this episode. Despite the fact that them meeting and immediately being friends is very unrealistic, especially given the circumstances that they meet under. Like, I don't honestly think I've ever seen more forced, fake hugs in my life. Millie Gibson, however, gives an absolutely brilliant performance throughout, which is really impressive given her age and the material she's been given. Seriously, if you gave this character to a much less talented individual, she would not work nearly as effectively as she does, and that cannot be understated. Just look to Series 7 Clara as an example. The Doctor, on the other hand, is a much different story. While for the most part he's written really well, getting in a lot of funny and charming lines throughout the story, and like I said before, Ncuti is amazing in this role. This episode immediately makes you interested in his portrayal of the Doctor, and he's very likeable and charismatic throughout. But for some reason, much like the Star Beast, The Doctor himself is written very out of character in parts of this episode, particularly just the way he kills the Goblin King, and the way he cries in Carla's flat. While one is obviously much more egregious than the other, it cannot be understated how the Doctor just did not need to do this in this way, and the fact it seems to bear no weight on his conscience whatsoever even more amplifies how poor this moment is. Is it just tradition for the RTD2 era to have the Doctor's first story include them acting out of character? Speaking of acting out of character, though at this point he's 1 to 4, so it's not really out of character anymore, but why did Russell give this episode pretty much no plot whatsoever? I mean seriously, Russell isn't known for the best plots to stories. Most of the time he excels at amazing character work and drama and tackling deep political themes with thoughtful commentary in his stories, while the plot usually takes a bit of a back seat. But it's very clear, or at least it was very clear, in the past, that he has a very creative and brilliant mind capable of telling amazing stories with amazing characters. But here, this episode's plot is so incredibly paper thin, dull and deficient that even the decent character work can't distract you from how underwhelming this story is. I mean seriously, the plot is that the goblins are attracted to Ruby because she had some bad luck, and then a bunch of coincidences keep drawing them in until the Doctor and Ruby converge, escape, then the goblins eat Ruby in the past and the Doctor goes back in time and kills them. Then Ruby joins the TARDIS. Seriously, that is it. And this episode goes on for almost a fucking hour with this nothing plot. If the character work was stronger, then this wouldn't be nearly as egregious, but without it, it just makes this episode very hollow and uninteresting, especially with the hindsight of the rest of the series making this episode pretty disappointing, and a pretty disappointing way to start this new era of the show. And I think the lack of depth this story has is even further amplified by how much better Rose, the Christmas Invasion, and the 11th Hour introduces its characters, and gives them all depth from the start, while this story just doesn't. I don't remember for the life of me, but I'm sure even Deep Breath does this better. It also doesn't help that this story is incredibly juvenile and childish, making some parts of it really embarrassing to watch. Something that also applies to the next episode, because up next is Earth Babies. I don't want to say the name of the episode yet because I know I'm probably going to end up hearing it 100,000 times in that next review and it's going to drive me insane. Wish me luck because that shit is awful. And this can lead to some natural exposition. So we cut to our new companion, Ruby Sundley. What an absolute schlocky pile of contrived, half-baked, undercooked, raw, gromless fuck.